Oh, my gavel. We'll go ahead and start our meeting this morning. This is the 32nd meeting of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. We are, of course, here pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, February 10th, talking about C-23. And we have with us in the first panel two good friends, actually. Mr. Casey, it's great to see you. It's great to have a little chat with you this morning. I haven't seen you in a long time, so good to see you. And the Honourable Laurie Hahn is also with us today. Now, you each have opening statements. I will defer to you. I think, Mr. Casey, if you wanted to go. Sorry? Certainly.
Just pour dire...
I just wanted to say on the record that we would like to talk a little bit about the motion that we tabled last time, if it is possible to reserve a few minutes at the end of today's meeting.
Interested in getting the DPP in for the Monday we return. Were we able to lock that in, sir?
I was able to do that for you, Mr. Christofferson.
Pardon?
You will be joining us with the Quebec Chief Electoral Officer on the Monday we return.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
And we look forward to that. That we think is our last group of witnesses. Mr. Casey, I was just getting to you and saying if you have an opening statement, we'd love you to go first.
Thank you very much.
Around 5 minutes would be great.
First of all, I just want to say I was a member of this committee 10 years ago, and I have to say it wasn't near as exciting as it is now, or interesting, kind of dull, and nobody much watched it or kept track of it, but you've done a lot to raise the profile.
Well, we believe it's the chair, but
I believe
other
it
than
is,
that,
too,
no,
absolutely. It's the leadership of the chair.
Please, Mr. Casey, get started.
I believe that Bill C-23, the Fair Elections Act, is an opportunity to correct a very unfair aspect of Elections Canada rules, which have been in place for many years. I'm referring to the different set of rules which allow a candidate belonging to a recognized party to begin to raise money, issue tax receipts, and prepare for the next election long before the election is called. A different set of rules govern independent candidates, which prevent them from doing anything in preparation for a campaign until after the election is called. As a for instance, all of you can issue tax receipts through your EDAs to contributors today. But in order to encourage supporters to make contributions now to your anticipated 2015 campaign. An independent candidate running against you in the same riding cannot do this. An independent candidate can only begin to raise money and issue tax receipts after the election is called. Two sets of rules and very unfair. I'm sure that some of the members of Parliament at this table had funds left over from their campaign account in the last election. That money was probably transferred to your riding association account, and now those funds are available to be returned to your 2015 campaign account to be used in the next election. If an independent candidate running against you had funds left over in his or her campaign account after the last election, the money had to be surrendered to the Receiver General of Canada and will not be returned to them if they decide to run again in the next election. Again, two sets of rules. I'm sure that all of you have signs available and information prepared well ahead before the next election, or will have. An independent candidate running against you can only commit to any purchase after the election is called, and again, 2 sets of rules. As an interesting example, I've attached an invitation from the Internet to a fundraiser event being held to raise money for the riding of the Honorable Pierre Poilievre in anticipation of the next election. The fee to attend is $125 per person, and attendees are provided a tax receipt for $99. An independent candidate running against him is not allowed to do this. Only after the next election is called is an independent candidate allowed to raise money or raise funds and issue tax receipts. Very unfair 2 sets of rules. I don't mean to pick on the minister, as most MPs from all parties will be raising funds in the coming months in exactly the same way, but it is a good example. Further, $75 of every $125 ticket for Minister Poilievre's fall fundraiser will come from the taxpayers of Canada through the tax credit system. An independent candidate running against him cannot access these tax credit benefits in the same way prior to the election being called. Please ask yourself if you would consider it fair if your opposition in the next election could raise money earlier than you can, raise more money than you can, and could make campaign arrangements earlier than you can for the next election. Ask yourself if you would consider it fair if you had to forfeit cash left over from your campaign, but all the competitors that ran against you could keep theirs. In fact, I ran and won as an independent in the 2008 election. The Conservative, Liberal, and NDP candidates in my riding were all able to keep the excess funds from the campaign. As an independent, I was required to surrender my remaining funds. Again, 2 sets of rules. Although these rules have been in place for many years, Bill C-23 seems to exacerbate the disparity. The provision that would generously allow political parties to exempt certain campaign expenses incurred over the previous 5 years before an election would provide no benefit for independents. I believe that this inequitable situation can be corrected relatively easy, and if independent candidates were allowed to provide a mechanism so they could establish an entity similar to an electoral district association, which would perform the same function as your EDAs for party candidates, most of the problems would be resolved. In any case, I'm sure that knowledgeable officials will be able to resolve these inequities if directed to do so by this committee. After the election of 1993, and again after the election of 2000, Elections Canada referred to these disparities as draconian and recommended they be changed. And now this is the chance to do it. The Fair Election Act is an opportunity to correct this most unfair aspect of our election rules, and I urge you to amend the bill to ensure that independent candidates are governed exactly the same rules as party-sponsored candidates. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Mr. Hahn, please, 5 minutes or less. Or...
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today and tell you about our experiences in the 2006 federal election in Edmonton Centre. My motivation in being here is the concern we all share for fair elections in Canada, and perhaps to dispel the notion that some may have that election fraud does not happen in Canada. None of what I say will be an indictment of Elections Canada, but the simple fact of human nature is that there will always be those who, for their own gain, will want to cheat, whether it's on their taxes, EI claims, insurance claims, or elections. Election fraud will probably always be attempted, and to some extent will always succeed. Elections Canada's job and our job is to try to stay a step ahead of people who will always try to find new ways to get around the rules and will always try to find new holes when old holes are plugged. We were concerned about abuse of voter information cards in 2004. We knew that many people received more than one card, and the availability of extra cards and the lack of other ID requirements created an environment that made fraud much easier. Scrutineers reported many cases of voters using VIC cards and nothing else for ID. We also knew that it was not uncommon for stacks of VIC cards to be left in the lobbies of apartment buildings and condominiums. Although VIC cards were not intended to be ID in 2006 election, that's how many people used them. All you needed was a VIC card and a name on the voters list. It also encouraged some people to try to make a few bucks by selling them. I personally received one phone call during the campaign offering to sell me hundreds of VIC cards. It was in the heat of the campaign. I simply declined rudely and got back to campaigning in what was a typically tight election race in Edmonton Centre. Ultimately, in 2006 election, we had scrutiny reports, some of which I've given to the clerk, about voters using only VIC cards for ID. Another hot topic at the moment is vouching. Again, in 2004, we had reports from scrutineers of groups of voters arriving by bus and being vouched for by one person. In 2006, we had scrutineers trained like pit bulls. And we had reports from scrutineers of having turned away van loads of prospective voters, of insisting with DROs who seemed willing to go along with it, that we were prepared to take immediate legal action to stop it. Again, in the heat of Election Day, our interest was getting through the day without allowing any fraud, intentional or inadvertent, to take place. The really important circumstance for us in 2006 was the very considerable errors in Elections Canada's voters list. We received an email from a lawyer who advised that another lawyer had been bragging about the number of times that he had voted for the winning candidate in 2004 based on the number of leases he held in that riding, which numbered 14. We weren't given his name, but obviously that put us on high alert. Partway through the writ period, my campaign manager, Vitor Marciano, had a conversation with an Elections Canada official who told him that she had already stricken about 700 people off the Edmonton Centre voter list for being clearly improperly registered. She had to discontinue that scrutiny due to other assigned duties, and Mr. Marciano is willing to testify to that information. We received what was to be the final version of the list 5 days before the election, and we put a team together all night going over the list of some 92,000 voters looking for anomalies. We found them right away, with as many as 20 or 30 people registered to vote from the same address, most of which were obviously non-residential. I'd be happy to outline some of the fraudulent addresses during questions. We immediately went public with a press release, news articles, and other aggressive electronic media. Official complaints were filed with the Commissioner of Elections by our campaign manager, Vitor Marciano, and by our national campaign co-chair, John Reynolds. About 400 people were removed from the voter list, and we knew of several hundred more we just didn't have time to get to. We made it clear that we would challenge suspect voters and that we would seek to press charges against anyone attempting to vote fraudulently. We can never know how many people we deterred from cheating, but we went from losing by 721 votes to winning by 3,600 votes. Obviously, there were other factors at play, but we were determined to win or lose honestly. At no time did I then, nor will I now, accuse my opponent of participating knowingly in what went on, simply that there are sometimes volunteers or supporters who are more enthusiastic than the law would normally allow. I have with me some copies of the questionable listings, some handwritten scrutiny reports, media release, official complaints, and the final response from Elections Canada, which I've given to the clerk. The final response from Elections Canada to our campaign manager was dated 22 November 2006. The investigation concentrated on 93 voters who had cast ballots, 74 of which were actually contacted, and it was found that 16 had voted in the wrong electoral district. They concluded correctly that this small number of ineligible ballots had not affected the election result this time. But I will remind the committee that the winning margin in Edmonton Centre in 1993 was 12 votes. And many other elections are won by the tiniest of margins. If one does some simple math with the 16 out of 74 checked against all the names removed, the number of potential voting errors, intentional or accidental, would number well into the hundreds. Such numbers could indeed influence the outcome of an election. Mr. Chair, my aim today is simply to help people understand that election fraud at some level is regrettably part of every election. And we all need to take every measure possible to make sure that elections are fair. I know that we all want to see voter turnout increase, but personally, I would rather have an election with certainty of the result than an election with a large turnout of questionable voters. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you both for staying in your time. We will go to a 7-minute round, starting with Mr. Lukiski.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both, Mr. Casey and Mr. Hahn, for being here. Mr. Hahn, I'll just start my questions with you. You have, excuse me, you were probably, with the exception of perhaps of Mr. Wisniewski, who appeared here yesterday, the first witness we've had who has either some documented, alleged, or attempted fraud examples to give us, or perhaps you even have some verification of real fraud. Obviously, the critics have been saying that there really is no evidence of fraud whatsoever, and therefore, why do you need to get rid of vouching? Why do you want to change the system with VIC? So I'd just like you to expand, if you can, Mr. Hahn, on some of the information that you uncovered during the 2006 election, and more specifically, whether or not you think that fraud did occur in your riding of Edmonton Centre in either the 2004 or 2006 election, and whether or not, under the current provisions to eliminate vouching, if that would have an effect on preventing this type of action from happening again.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lukiski, and I do believe fraud occurred in 2004, 2006 in Edmonton Centre, and I don't believe it's just in Edmonton Centre. That would be extremely naive to think that. Let me give you just some of the examples of the misregistration that we found, and some would be accidental, but some of it was, to me, clearly not accidental. About 100 apparently non-existent addresses in Edmonton's downtown core. Some of them were fictional addresses in between two real buildings. Hundreds of people registered to vote under their law offices, medical offices, accounting offices, Government of Canada offices. In some cases, again, maybe genuine errors. In other cases, entire families were registered to vote out of where the red earner worked. Dozens of people registered to vote out of office towers, but who did not list a suite number, simply a street number, to make it look like a residential address. In many cases, these people were also registered to vote in other ridings using their home addresses. Other cases, voters living in other ridings, but only registered in Edmonton Centre. Dozens of people registered to vote out of small mailbox locations or from self-storage yards, and there's no legitimate way a person can appear on a list of electors from a self-storage yard. That's just, I don't believe that's accidental. 18 people registered to vote out of a truck stop, people registered to vote out of karaoke bars, lingerie stores, dance lounges, galleries, you name it. Now, again, fraud is extremely, extremely hard to prove intent and all that kind of stuff. So, it's true to say there's very little convictions or that sort of thing. But I sat in on the PROC meetings in 2006, just after the election, because of the concerns we had from Edmonton Centre with Mr. Kingsley and others. And we weren't the only ones who were talking about this. Stephen McKinnon, Liberal Party National Director, said the misuse of voter identification cards is quite simply out of control. We have reports of neighborhoods where individual single-family dwelling mailboxes, not apartments, were systematically demailed, i.e. stolen, of such cards. With the greatest respect to the Chief Electoral Officer, when he appeared before you in April, he mischaracterized the entire problem. It's not about using cards as identification for purpose of registering, which is absurd because if you've got the card, obviously you're registered. It's a matter of using the cards as identification when voting, and clearly if you could, in those days, 04 and 06, I don't think now, show up with a VIC card, and that's all you needed. Marcel Guimond, who is an MP for the Bloc Québécois, members around the table have all campaigned, and like me, have had occasion to observe that in election campaigns when we enter residential buildings, multiple unit dwellings, at the entrance where the mailboxes are, we see a series of voter identification information cards in the blue recycling bin or else outside scattered across the lawn. In the 2004 election, I brought back approximately 150 to the office of the returning officer. And it goes on. There's an exchange between Mr. Kingsley, who said on polling day the only place she can vote is at a polling station where she is registered by her address. There are no exceptions. Mr. Godin, who's an NDP member at the time and still, said back, yes, unless she has 6 cards and goes to various polling stations. Jean-Pierre Kingsley made it clear again that in 2006 general election, the voter information card is not a voter information card, not a voter identification card. But that is in fact how they were used, and I don't think that's the case now. But Bloc Québécois members, Pauline Picard, people can go to 10 different polling stations with cards that do not belong to them. They can vote in the place of 10 other people by going to different polling stations. Voter cards can be picked up in various buildings. Often the person who is delivering them is unable to enter a large building and simply drops them on the floor. There are boxes full of cards that simply sit there. Marcel Proulx, member for Hull-Aylmer. Often when you visit a multiple unit building, you knock on the door of an apartment where, according to the voters list, there should be 6 occupants. When talking to the person who was inside, you were told there are not 6 people because this is a bachelor apartment. There was only one person living there for the last 3, 4, or 5 years. It's then that we realize that the names on the list are those of previous occupants. Well, every one of those previous occupants, if their name's on the list, there's a voter ID card in their name. And Mr. Reid commented about his getting 3 cards. So we had people come in, Asians, and no fault of their own, but they would fairly routinely get, Chinese people would get 2 cards, Vietnamese people would often get 3 just because of the transposition of names. Now, we didn't collect a bunch of those, but we had a couple of people who knew us, came in and said, look what I got. Now, they had no intention of using them, and nobody, I'm not accusing anybody of anything specific, just that the potential for fraud was absolutely clear, and it has to be awfully naive to think that some people didn't use those. And obviously, it was known in the community because of people trying to, pawn them off for money. I mean, I can go on with other things that members of other parties have said with respect to the requirement for vouching. Here's a quote from Stephen McKinnon, National Director of the Liberal Party. I was going to comment on Mr. Hahn's observation about the bus with 40 people. Suffice it to say that we are concerned, as he seems to be, about what we call serial vouching. And we are profoundly troubled by a number of on-site registrations, 55,000 at advance polls, plus 795,000 at election day polls, for a total of 840,000, or an average of over 2,700 people per riding. It was not just me, it was not just the Conservative candidates who were concerned about this. It was candidates from all parties and officials from all parties.
About 10 seconds, Mr. Lukowski.
Just wanted to get your comments, since the serial vouching provisions have been eliminated, but vouching is still allowed on a one-to-one basis, whether you think that vouching should be retained or eliminated.
Well,
Very quickly.
the rule always was one-for-one vouching, not one for 40. So, that rule hasn't changed. I think there's room for vouching if it stays one-for-one, and if the voucher, if that ballot is put aside with the information on it, and the identity and the validity of the voucher is verified before that vote is counted.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Scott, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very quick question to my colleague, Mr. Hahn. This was 2006. Do you have similar stories or accounts from 2008 or 2011?
No. And the reason for that, prior to 2006, including 2006, the races in Edmonton Centre were extremely tight. We had suspicions, as I said, from 04, which put us on high alert, and that's why we took the preemptive actions that we did. In 08, we knew it was not going to be as close a race. We still had scrutineers. We did a lot of the same things, but we weren't as concerned about a small amount of inappropriate voting affecting the result.
And are you aware that at the moment, under the regime that was put in place in 2011 in a number of trial locations amounting to about 900,000 people being able to use the VICs, the voter information cards, that you need a second piece of identity. So if somebody received a card that's in the name of a previous occupant, they would actually have to go out of their way to forge a second piece of ID, and they would also have to have the intention. And you kind of indicated that the people you were talking about who were saying, look, I received something with two different versions of my name, and you said they have no intention of using them. And I honestly think that that's what the system now is all about, is the sense that you virtually can't use them because you have to have both the intention, you have to be willing to risk being discovered, and then you have to find a way to forge a second piece of ID using the VIC. So I'm just wondering why we would see this as particularly relevant now.
What I was covering, and I tried to make that clear, I was covering our experiences in the 2006 election.
Right.
There were changes. There were changes made because of what happened to us in 2006, because of the complaint that we filed with the Commissioner of Elections and the conversations we had with Mr. Kingsley.
And my point, Mr. Hahn, is that I don't the abuse potential that you are reading into the current system based on your experiences then don't exist.
Sorry, I may not have made myself too clear. What I'm talking about is the fact that election fraud does exist in Canada, and people will find a way. We plug holes, and that was a hole that needed to be plugged, and it has been plugged to the maximum extent.
Great.
My point is we need to stay alert for other measures because people will always find a way. People are very creative and inventive, and folks who want to will always find a way to get around the rules somehow.
Okay, and I guess that is kind of where I differ. I think that essentially the gains for voter fraud of this sort are just so limited that's why the research literature shows that voter impersonation is so limited. Could I add, Mr. Casey, did the minister reply to the letter that you included in your materials that we've seen?
Actually, I wrote him twice, and there was no reply. I didn't get a reply from him, or an acknowledgement, which I think is kind of disrespectful to my letter was respectful. It outlined the issues, and I did not get a response, which I was disappointed. I wrote it on February the 5th. I wrote a second letter, and I have yet to receive a response.
Given your stature in the pantheon of former MPs, I think that's significant. Could I please pass on my remaining 3.5 minutes to Mr. Rathgeber, Mr. Chair?
Permission of the committee to do so? Sure. Mr. Rathgeber?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for that indulgence. Mr. Casey, first let me say how much I appreciate your advocacy on behalf of independent candidates. And I listened with interest about the two sets of rules between party-affiliated candidates and independents, and I couldn't agree more. So in 2006, you were elected as a Conservative candidate in Amherst, Nova Scotia, and in 2008, you were re-elected as an independent.
Exactly.
So that it's conceivable, based on these differential rules, that the Conservative candidate who campaigned against you in 2008 was able to rely on a surplus that you might have left him following the 2006 election. Is that fair?
It was a substantial surplus, as I recall, but he received it. But and in 2008, when I ran, it's kind of ironic that I won the election, but I was the only one that had to forfeit my cash balance. And unfortunately, it takes cash to run an election. If I wanted to run again, I would not have that money available that I had left. But all of the candidates that ran against me would have it. Right. It's simple. There's 5 candidates in my riding, 4 run by one set of rules, and a completely different set of rules applies to the other.
You can appreciate that in 2015 I faced the same dilemma where there will be a Conservative candidate who will be running to unseat me with money that I raised in 2011.
I'm familiar with that.
Can you, based on your inquiries or your research, have you been able to determine any rational explanation for why Elections Canada and why the current legislation prohibits non-affiliated candidates from raising money and or issuing receipts between writ periods?
My only conclusion is it was an oversight when the rules were drafted, because after the 1993 election and then after the 2000 election, Elections Canada made recommendations to change it. And in fact, in their paper that I got off the internet, their recommendation after the 2000 election, it says, and I read, the fact is that that concerns respecting independent candidate surpluses can easily be addressed without resort to the draconian form of forfeiture that is currently employed. So they're saying that the current rules are draconian. And that's Elections Canada rules. And they made a recommendation at that time to change that. They also made the recommendation to change it in 93, so I don't know why it's changed. It hasn't changed.
You may be aware that in 2003 the Supreme Court ruled that the Section 3 Charter-protected right to vote extends to more than just the right to cast a ballot. The Court indicated that a voter must have an opportunity to balance various ideas in his or her own mind before meaningfully participating in an election process. In your mind, and I realize you're not a lawyer, Mr. Casey, but in your mind, does the prohibition and the clear handicapping of independent candidates, in your view, does that promote fair elections, or in your non-lawyer view, would that be a violation of the right to meaningful participation in an election?
It's the most clear aspect of Elections Canada to me, and it's the most unfair example. It may be not the most important example of unfairness, but it is the clearest example of unfairness. When we allow individuals to run for office, but some have a different set of rules than others. And that is just simply unfair. And if we're going to allow independent candidates to run, if any Canadian wants to run, they should be allowed to run. And if they're allowed to run, they should have the same rules as everybody else. And that's not what we have today. And in Elections Canada words, they couldn't have said it better. I love it. They say they are draconian regulations. And I urge you to analyze these and change them. I urge you to bring Elections Canada officials to come in and say why they use the word draconian. Why are their own rules draconian? And how should you change them?
Thank you, Mr. Casey. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Mr. Ethgeber. We'll move to it's not Mr. Sims, it's Mr. Lamoureux. I've not seen the two of you together. I'm still saying it's the same person.
We do look alike, I guess, Mr. Engineer. Mr. Hahn, you've emphasized time and time again how fearful of you are of fraud, and that's what this is all about. Do you believe that Elections Canada has a role to play in preventing fraud from taking place? Do you believe that at the end of the day, Elections Canada has a role to prosecute and to, wherever they can, where it is believed that fraud takes place?
Yes, they do. The difficulty, as you know and as everybody around this table knows, in the heat of an election, it's extremely hard to get that proof.
But you want Elections Canada to get down to the brass knuckles and prosecute fraud?
No, what I want is for this committee and for us as parliamentarians and for Election Canada to plug every hole that they can possibly plug, knowing full well that there's going to be inventive people out there who will find some way around it. This will be an ongoing challenge.
Sure, and I agree with that wholeheartedly, right? Elections Canada also wants to deal with issues related to fraud. Mm-hmm. They want to do that, and that's one of the reasons why they came up with the recommendation that they need and require the ability to compel a witness, something in which other provincial jurisdictions actually can do in terms of their independent election officers. Mm-hmm. Don't you believe that if you want Elections Canada to get to the truth of the fraud, of allegations of fraud, that they should be, at the very least, able to compel a witness to come forward and tell what has transpired?
Well, from my understanding, Mr. Lamoureux, Elections Canada has the tools necessary, the police forces have, and so on, prosecute whatever the offense is. They have those.
But if Election Canada tells you that if they had the ability to compel a witness, that would help them deal with those fraudsters, potential fraudsters, would that not be something you would want to support, given the fact that other agencies have that ability?
That is something that this committee should be considering, and I know it is, as part of the study of Bill C-23. So I would leave it to the wisdom of the committee in the final result.
I agree with you, and I hope the wisdom will prevail on this particular issue. I'm somewhat suspect that it might not, but I'm an optimist. Elections Canada also has a role to tell people that the purpose of those voter identification cards. Would you not agree?
Well, they call them voter information cards, not voter identification cards, and that just points out what has been the problem and potential future problem if the ID requirements aren't properly met.
So there's an educational component there for Elections Canada.
Apparently for us, too.
For us and for all Canadians. Yeah. And who best not to lead it but Elections Canada? Would you not agree?
Elections Canada certainly has a role to play in that, absolutely.
Would you not recognize that the limitations in Section 18 will actually put limitations on Elections Canada in the type of things that it wants to do? So, for example, if it wants to do a study on what it is that you're suggesting that they do, with the idea of coming up with recommendations, if this legislation passes, it'll prevent them from doing that.
Well, what we were just talking about was the education of people on where to vote, how to vote, what they need to vote, which is where the voter information card or other forms of ID comes in.
But, you know, at the end of the day, what we're both trying to achieve is justice on the issue. If we want to be able to deal with improving the voter identification or voter, whatever it is that you would like to phrase it, that it's best to enable Elections Canada to be able to do the necessary research and advertising so that Canadians and politicians, myself included, are aware of what those cards are all about and the purpose, correct?
Yeah, fundamentally or philosophically, I don't disagree with that. But again, it's not me calling them a voter information card.
So we'll have to wait and see if, in fact, we'll have to wait and see if the government actually brings forward those amendments. Because again, I'm an optimist. Let's hope that they do that. You know, when we look at the VIC cards. In Ottawa, I have a one-bedroom apartment. I go there periodically. I check the mail, and on the window ledges, you see all these what were former tenants, I suspect. They all have IDs, addresses written on them. I suspect bills. Who knows what's all there? But I would suggest to you that there is some flaws within those data banks, also government data banks. Do you think that there is a perfect data bank that's out there?
No, absolutely not. But, you know, Elections Canada needs to do everything, and it'll never be perfect because people move, obviously, all the time.
That's right.
But they need to, and I don't know what the solution is, but they need to scrub the lists much more.
That's right. But you know what? You hit the nail right on. All data banks have flaws in them. Right?
And that means all information from all data banks is open to abuse.
That's correct. So what we should be looking at doing is ways in which we can change and inform and improve the Canada Elections Data Bank. Would you not agree with that?
That would be a big responsibility that Elections Canada, and I'm sure they do undertake it to the best of their ability, but it's a continuing responsibility that they need to pay attention to.
Right.
I still get mail for Lisa Crawford, who you would know as a Liberal staffer.
Absolutely. So when I think of those VIC cards, let's improve the data bank. Try to look at ways in which maybe we can incorporate them, as it's been pointed out. It's not, you can't just walk in, here's the VIC card, let me vote. You have to also provide other forms of identification.
And that's a big improvement after 2006.
Right. Would you think that maybe instead of 39 pieces of qualifying ID, why not have 40 and just use it as one on the consideration that Elections Canada needs to improve the quality of that particular data bank?
Well, back in 2006 when we testified at PROC with the various members of the committee and so on, one of the things that was pointed out was the Quebec system. And I don't know if the Quebec system has changed, but they had a system at that time of providing various forms of ID. And there were a lot of people who sat in those chairs who said, hey, we should be looking at what Quebec does. And it's part of the same thing you're talking about, is making sure that however somebody winds up getting identified, that you take away every opportunity, if you possibly can, of somebody being misidentified intentionally or accidentally as a voter.
I must say, Mr. Hahn, I'm kind of in favor of you taking membership on this particular committee. I could use some support in some of the things that you're saying.
Well, I hope I haven't been too supportive.
When you look at it, and at the end of the day, there is a need to see amendments, I believe, brought forward to improve the legislation. One of the ideas was, why not allow individuals to give an affidavit? So if I go to a place and I sign my name off, swear my name off on an affidavit that I live at this particular address and maybe have one piece of ID, that I should be able to vote. Do you think committee should be open to something?
I mean, affidavits are part of the system now and have been for as long as I've known. Affidavits, in our experience, in 04, certainly in 06, and we suspect in 04, were abused. So, I mean, no system is perfect. I mean, that can be part of, a broader system. There's a whole lot of things that have a role to play.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Lamoureux.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We'll move on to a 4-minute round. Mr. Lukiski, you're starting that one off. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hahn. Just to follow up a little bit on what Kevin was saying, and one of the provisions of the Elections Act, the Bill C-23, is to oblige Elections Canada to advertise and communicate more aggressively with voters as to the hows to vote as well as the wheres and whens. And the how meaning what kind of ID to present, which would eliminate a lot of the problems with the VIX. But I would also point out that the only true way to eliminate voter fraud, because of the problems everyone has with databases, and I fully agree with that, the only true way is to produce proper identification. Not through vouching, not through voter information cards, but through proper identification. Someone told me just a day or so ago that if you wanted to renew, as an example, if you wanted to renew your Ontario health card now, you know the process you have to go through? You have to produce 3 pieces of ID to get your Ontario health card. So every single societal privilege or right that we seem to have except for voting requires one to produce proper identification. That's just a normal function of who we are and the times in which we live. So I would just suggest that getting back to the root of this whole discussion, whether or not vouching should be eliminated or whether VIX should be allowed, we have roughly 18 months or a little slightly less before the next election. If people were educated now as to the kinds of identification that are required and the options to produce identification that are available, I think a lot of the problems that we see, if there have been problems, would be eliminated. And I'd just like to see you have your comment on that.
I agree totally. I mean, we are giving it a lot of publicity through this committee and across the country and so on. And whether it's 39 or whether you can have 45 or whatever the number is, people know this is coming. And I'm sorry, there is virtually no excuse for anybody to not have some of those, one or more of those forms of ID. I just don't personally buy that. And if you go back to, again, folks, back in 2006, and I'm referring to Quebec, and I'm not sure what the specific rules were, but a lot of people there were referring to what went on in Quebec, and there was a bunch of different forms of ID that were allowed, and that seemed in 06. In the rest of Canada, you showed up with a VIC card, and that was it. Quebec was taking it, I think, a little bit more advanced, a little bit more seriously at that time. Going down the road, the surest way, perhaps, maybe we can never get there, probably can't ever get there, but is biometrics, retina scan, fingerprints, whatever. Now, that's a little more complicated, obviously, in establishing that system, but I agree. I mean, fundamentally, and as I said in my comment, I would rather have an election with certainty of the vote than an election where we have no idea how many people voted illegitimately.
Time, Chair?
45 seconds.
Quick comment. You mentioned that you encountered some it seemed to be serious attempts at fraud in the 2004 and 2006 elections. I would suggest that probably where fraud is more likely to occur is in those ridings where everyone knows that it's going to be close. I would assume back in 04 and 06 you have done your own polling, and everyone else in opposition camps had done their polling, knew that it was going to be a tight election. That's where I think that fraud, if it's going to occur, would occur, at least attempted fraud, to try and change the outcome of an election in an area or a riding where they knew it was going to be tight. And I'd just like a quick comment from you.
Yeah, and that goes, again, back to my comment. I would never accuse my Liberal opponent in 04 and 06 of deliberately doing that, but in a tight race, supporters and volunteers are very enthusiastic, and sometimes, as I said, they are more enthusiastic than the law would normally allow. and that will happen in tight races. That's just
Thank
life.
you. Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Christopherson, and you're sharing a bit, I think. But
Yeah, hopefully, although I do tend to go on. Thank you, Chair. Thank you both very much. Mr. Casey, good to see you again. Always good to see a former colleague serve together. Mr. Hahn, I really wasn't going to comment too much, simply because so far the only parade of people that the government can bring in here to allege the argument that there's so much potential fraud is card-carrying conservatives, a caucus colleague no less. I just got to tell you, from 30,000 feet, I don't know how much people are going to put on that. Not that they're questioning I'm not questioning your integrity, sir, at all, but I am pointing from 30,000 feet. The best this government could do was to bring in not just another card-carrying conservative, not just another one, but an actual caucus member who's going to come in and make an argument that none of the experts that have come forward can verify and support. So I find that interesting. But I do, in listening to your testimony, sir, I would just mention to you when you say that you don't personally buy that people don't have the ID, with the greatest of respect, I urge you to review the testimony of people who've been in here representing homeless Canadians, Aboriginal Canadians. All of these people are just as entitled to their vote as you and me, and they would argue very strongly that there are Canadians in circumstances where they don't have this kind of ID, and they will not be able to vote. And that's one of the requests that we've had from people coming in is, please listen to us. We're telling you that there are fellow Canadians that are not going to be able to vote. Could there be anything more important as we're reviewing this bill than that? So I urge you to review that testimony and perhaps rethink the argument that if you don't have the ID that we all carry here every day, that you're not entitled to vote. Anyway, I urge you to review that, because that's not the testimony we're getting. I don't have a lot of time. I want to mention too that one of the things that's not been disputed, at least I haven't heard the testimony, is that enumeration is a bad idea. In fact, I've heard all kinds of people make the argument that enumeration works, and I don't know why that's not on the table. And that's my segue to my question to you, Mr. Casey, because you asked us, I jotted down some of your comments, this needs more focus, this needs some analysis, bring in the experts to ask them in terms of the issues that you've raised, but I need to point out to you that this process doesn't allow that. There is not enough time for us to bring in those experts. Your comments are probably the only focus we're going to get. And yet, by rights, we should be holding separate hearings on that clause alone, getting all the experts in and understanding why is that circumstance and what are the changes we should make, understand unintended consequences, which this government has no interest in pursuing. And that's what should be happening. But, sir, this process is not allowing that. So maybe your thoughts on the process that should be in place to allow you to raise these issues and to allow us to dig into the other issues.
Well, the thing that comes to my mind when I go on the Internet, and I can see on the Internet where Elections Canada brought this to the attention of the governments, all governments, since 1993, in 2 written reports, that this is the most unfair aspect of Elections Canada. And it's not been addressed. And I wonder if the drafters of this bill, the Fair Elections Act, looked at those recommendations and didn't regard them or didn't look at them. But to me, the Elections Canada has made these recommendations twice and called them draconian, their own rules draconian, and I repeat that word because it's very effective. But so there's something wrong in the process when Elections Canada makes those recommendations twice. To me, it's the most obvious unfair aspect of Elections Canada. And I often think they should change the name of the act if you're not going to make that fair. I mean, you can't call it the Fair Elections Act if you allow this unfairness to remain, I don't think.
We see the same.
But the process, your question is about the process, and I think there is something lacking in the process. If Elections Canada criticizes their own regulations and nothing's done about it.
But you need to know that the only people who have had input into this are people who carry a Conservative membership card. No other Canadian has had input into this bill except people who carry a Conservative membership card. My apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Reid, 4 minutes, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to set the record straight on one of the things that Mr. Christopherson said, the view I got from 30,000, or maybe it was slightly higher, 31,000 feet than Mr. Christofferson. I seem to recall you mentioned testimony on this very subject, the problems that exist with vouching and with voter information cards being misused from members of other parties, and you simply went to the testimony they provided in 2006 in this committee. Those include some New Democrats, among others. Am I right?
And let me respond to Mr. Christofferson's comments. First of all, we've got 18 months or so till the next election. There are other people out there who should be involved in helping get ID for people like homeless people and on First Nations reserves and so on. We all have a responsibility to get there. At the end of the day, I think it would be extremely rare that somebody would have a legitimate excuse, maybe not impossible, but rare for somebody to have a legitimate excuse. And Mr. Christofferson, is my turn now. Mr. Christofferson, I'm a fighter pilot, and I've done a lot of flying at 30,000 feet and higher, and I can't see a heck of a lot from 30,000 feet and higher. But when I get down low level, I can see what's going on. And Marcel Proulx, who is a Liberal MP, Marcel Guimond, who is a Bloc MP, and Mr. Hebert, who is an NDP official. Mr. Proux's comment was, first, the Liberal Party is also in the process of preparing its list of errors and horror stories. We'll table it once it's finished because it's a fairly exhaustive list. Mr. Guimond, from the outset, I should say that we are currently compiling, once again, a list of the horror stories from the last election campaign, and I'm deliberately calling them horror stories rather than mistakes. So, Mr. Christofferson, with respect, yeah, you can have a view from 30,000 feet. That's not where it's going on. It's going on at ground level, at sea level. And that's where you have to go to get the stories. That's where the stories came from to us. That's where the stories came from to members of the other parties in 2006, and they were not dissimilar from the stories that we were telling.
Thank you. The other thing I wanted to do is to just mention, with response to Mr. Lamoureux's observation, he said, what we need, the crying shame is that the government is preventing us from doing the following things: letting Elections Canada inform people, the Chief Electoral Officer inform people of things like how to become a candidate, how an elector may vote, and what days, times, and locations are available for voting, how an elector may establish their identity and residence in order to vote, including the pieces of identification they may use, how to make sure they get on the list. All these things I'm actually reading are the things that he is mandated to do by this law that, quite frankly, he is not doing right now, and he is required to do these things under this legislation. So I think, Mr. Lamoureux, you got your facts backwards. Well, okay.
Through the witnesses or through the chair, but to each other doesn't seem to work real well around here.
Mr. Chair, don't believe what he's telling you. Mr. Lamoureux asserts that he didn't say that. The record will show when it's published that he said exactly that, and he has his facts wrong. He just hasn't read the bill. How can anybody who comments on every single bill manage to reach one in detail? But this time he's just literally said the opposite of the truth, and I'm just setting the record straight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. You still have another minute if you'd like it.
Oh, well, actually, no, I'll take it. And actually, Mr. Casey, I do want to bring up something with you. I think your point is really good. You drew that to my attention and showed me where the Chief Electoral Officer had in the 2000 election complained about this, and he apparently did so in the 93 election. It strikes me that this must be part of the effort that was made, I guess it goes back to the 80s, to basically shut out third parties. Mr. Figaro, the head of the Communist Party, fought a courageous battle to get rid of the restrictions that made it hard for very small parties to compete in elections. I gather that the same effort has not yet occurred on behalf of independents. I think you're right. I suspect that that restriction is probably a violation of Section 3 of the Charter, which states not only that each person has the right to vote, but that everyone is qualified for membership in the House of Commons or a provincial legislature. And qualified has to mean something substantive, not that you can run a non-competitive campaign. So thanks for drawing that to our attention.
Can I comment on that?
A quick one, Mr. Casey.
Oh, it's just
feeling generous.
It's not only unfair to the candidate, it's unfair to contributors. I mean, as strange as it may seem, if I was running as an independent and Mr. Hahn was running for a party, and you wanted to make a contribution to me, to my campaign, you can make it once. In the 5 years leading up to and including a campaign, you can make the same contribution to him 5 times. You can give him $5,500 and get tax receipts for it, and I'm restricted to one contribution. And Elections Canada says, strangely, contributions to independent candidates are event-based. That means that the contribution limit applies to the event. And once it is reached, there can be no more contributions from the same individual to the independent candidate. Contributions to candidates who are supported by a party are calendar-based. That means that the contribution limit is attained for the calendar year, but the same individual can contribute up to his limit again every year.
before the campaign. So it is very wrong, and I hope that you'll make the amendments to make it fair.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. I see a little time on our clock, so we'll try 2 minutes. Mr. Richards and Ms. Latendresse.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hahn, you'd indicated, in one part of your remarks, I think it was in your remarks, that in 04 and 06, because there was a very tight race, you had indicated that some of this potential fraud that you think likely occurred, and you indicated that it's based on sort of the fact that the race is close and people get over enthusiastic, basically, was more of a concern to you than it may have been in 08 in terms of the election result. I'm sure it was a concern regardless, but in terms of maybe affecting the election result. So what I'm curious about is, obviously there would be a number of ridings across the country that would have been in a very similar situation to where you were in terms of a close race. How many ridings do you think in the country where these kinds of things could impact a result? And would that be enough that it could, in fact, change the overall result of an election?
Well, you'd have to go. Thank you for the question. I mean, you'd have to go and see what the winning margins were, and there were some pretty tight margins. I will just quote from Mr. Neufeld's report here, actually, that kind of touches on that. Times have changed, yet the basic voting service model has not. Most Canadians now vote in urban settings at central polling locations that house many polling stations. Meanwhile, electoral law and procedures still reflect an assumption that voting occurs at single station locations in separate rural communities. Clearly, the model is an antique. It could benefit from significant modernization. Indications of widespread and serious procedural errors in Etobicoke Centre, which was very close, and the national audits signal unmistakably that an overhaul is urgently required. However, built-in resistance to changing the mechanics of voting is strong. The two things people hate most are change and the way things are. And there's always going to be resistance, and that's what hopefully this committee will resolve.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Richard. Madame Latendresse, 2 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a very specific question for both of you. I'd like you to give us your opinions regarding what occurred in 2011, the massive case of fraud with the fraudulent calls in order to suppress voting. There were two specific recommendations that I'd like to speak to today that were made by the Chief Electoral Officer. I understand that he's now persona non grata, so we'll refer now henceforth to the Commissioner, who's the investigator, who's supposed to investigate cases of electoral fraud. He had requested those powers. The CEO, he had requested them in order to combat fraud in Canada. So the two powers were for the Commissioner to require testimony and for a call for information from political parties to ensure that electoral expenditures are in compliance with the Election Act. In your personal opinions, were these two recommendations, which were made by a huge amount of people, or should they be in the current legislation being up for consideration?
I'm sorry, I thought that question was directed to Mr. Hahn.
Well, I can go first if you want while you think about it. In terms of auditing expenses, obviously we need to audit expenses. We need to audit them very carefully because mistakes are made. And most of the times I think they are unintentional mistakes. Sometimes, they're not like anything else. With respect to the Commissioner of Elections' role, I think it's very important that the Commissioner and the Chief Electoral Officer are in fact separated, so that there is, clearly a prosecutorial part and an administrative part, if you will. If you mix those two under the one office and the one person, I don't think you want judge, jury, executioner, hangman all in the same body.
Il est là pour enquêter et il a demandé.
He's there to investigate. He specifically requested a specific power that would help him a lot. Why not give it to him?
Are you talking about the power to compel, or are you talking about well, again, from my understanding of the law, and I'm not a lawyer here, the authority is there that other prosecutorial or law enforcement agencies have.
Thank you. Mr. Casey, really quick.
I very strongly believe that he should report to Parliament, period.
And that will end this panel for today. We thank you both for coming. It's great to see you again, Mr. Casey, and Mr. Hahn. I know I see you all the time.
This is a different aspect, for sure.
left. I was watching the clock and hoping there might be one question possible with unanimous consent.
Well, you know that takes unanimous consent, but I'm trying to go a little quicker today because I've added committee business to the end of the second panel. That wasn't known to me when we started today.
So the little pleading you think won't
it was
get...
nice to plead, but let's...
All right.
I'm going to suspend while we change the panels, please. is back to order for the next session. We have three guests with us now. We have, from my left to right, from Apathy is Boring, Yuri Cormier. From the Fédération des étudiants Collège du Québec. I'll do my best, folks. It's a, was that okay?
Oh, oui, ben oui.
Okay. Iliane Laberge. Thank you. And Adam Shidleski, who we know has visited us before, but now he's a witness today, so we're happy to have you too, Adam. We're going to start with you for opening statements, Adam, and we'll work across that way. 5 minutes or less, please, and then we'll go to questions after all of the opening statements.
Sure. And thank you for inviting the Leanow community to testify before this committee. My name is Adam Shidleski, and I'm a co-founder of Leanow.ca. Our mission is to help people across Canada deepen our democracy to create a more open, just, and sustainable society. Canadians from all walks of life have expressed overwhelming opposition to the proposed changes to our elections law. From the 60,000+ Canadians who have signed our petition, to current and past chief electoral officers, to the Commissioner of Canada Elections, to the 160 Canadian and 19 international political science scholars, to journalists and editorial boards across the country, the response has been clear. The Fair Elections Act is fundamentally unfair. It stacks a deck in favor of the Conservative Party, and it cannot be fixed. The Leanow community therefore calls on you to recommend that the House of Commons kill the bill and start over from scratch. Unfortunately, this committee was unwilling to travel outside the Ottawa bubble to hear from Canadians across the country. I'm grateful that through the Leanow community, I'm able to directly convey to this committee the wisdom and concerns of everyday Canadians who share their perspective with us on Facebook and over email. To start, we're glad that the prohibition on vouching has received so much critical attention, both in the media and here in committee, and that reports indicate that Minister Poilievre may be open to changing course. Yet, unfortunately, the issue of vouching is only one of numerous significant concerns Canadians have with this bill. In fact, Leanne Tanguay expressed fear that the debate surrounding vouching is a red herring that Mr. Poilievre will eventually concede to give the appearance that the final bill is a reasonable compromise. Leanne outlined several of our community's other major concerns, stating that there is no good policy reason for the incumbent in a riding to appoint a polling supervisor, who, among other things, will have custody of advanced ballots. There is no reason to muzzle Elections Canada or to exempt fundraising costs from financing limits. There is no reason for investigations and their outcomes to be kept from the public. Gail Silva was specifically concerned that because of this new law, Canadians will never find out what happened in the robocall fraud of 2011. This fear appears to be well-founded, as Elections Canada recently decided to postpone their report on the robocall scandal until after the next election. It is completely outrageous that 3 years after the robocall fraud of 2011, Canadians still do not know which political operatives played dirty tricks during the last election. In response to this attack on our democracy, Elections Canada requested that Parliament provide our elections watchdog with the power to compel witness testimony, just like the Competitions Bureau can. This was partially because political operatives have refused to testify, significantly hampering the ability of Elections Canada to restore Canadians' faith in the integrity of our democracy. The robocall registry and new penalties for impersonating elections officials do not adequately empower Elections Canada to catch political operatives orchestrating elections fraud. Mary Colts wants to know why our elections watchdog was not given the specifically requested power to compel testimony. One of Patty Whitehouse's concerns is that removing the ability of Elections Canada to educate Canadians about voting and to encourage us is counterproductive to the goal of increasing voter engagement. While Minister Poilievre is correct that political parties are generally effective at encouraging Canadians to vote, that is only true insofar as in their interest to do so. Political parties have finite resources, and they target those resources at those demographic groups most likely to vote. And youth are by far the least likely to vote, so they are largely ignored. In fact, only 40% of youth said that political parties reached out to them, versus 75% of Canadians over 65 years old. And Elections Canada has found that young people who take courses in government or democracy are 14% more likely to vote than those who do not. The simple truth is that self-interested political parties are not adequately incentivized to conduct outreach to reverse the alarming trend of declining youth voter turnout. As Katie Olmsted and Matthew Olowski state, the crisis in Canadian democracy is one of low voter turnout, especially amongst our youth. In this context, we need to be giving Elections Canada more power and capacity, not less. Many Canadians have also sent in comments expressing outrage for the lack of consultation with experts, opposition parties, or Canadians before the introduction of a bill that is so fundamental to our democracy. One party ramming through such changes without widespread buy-in would cause Tim Thiessen, for example, to lose faith in our democratic process. Lastly, people like Megan Marintet and Holly Pender-Love wish that instead of fighting to protect our rights, we could be having a conversation around bold steps that could revitalize our democracy, such as moving towards online voting or making voting mandatory. From the Globe and Mail editorial board to nonpartisan chief electoral officers to respected academics to everyday Canadians, the message is clear. This bill is fundamentally flawed. It needs to be killed. Let's start from scratch together to collaboratively draft a truly fair elections law that all Canadians can support. Thank you. I look forward to hearing your question.
Thank you very much. Ms. Laberge?
La Fédération étudiante collégiale
The Fédération étudiante collégiale du Québec represents many organizations in Quebec with a total of 70,000 members. Since it was created, it has defended the rights of students in Cégep and also tries to increase the role of young people in democratic institutions. Our observations today are based on the work of independent organizations and government organizations who have the common cause of wanting to increase youth participation in democracy. We're also basing this on the observations that we've had with our members, particularly during the recent provincial election campaign. We are working to encourage young people to come out and vote, and we have spoken with thousands of students. We are the same age as our members, and so when they talk to us, they speak to us frankly and openly. The question of young people's voter turnout is something that we care a lot about. First of all, we believe it's important that young people participate in societal debates and that young people be included in these debates. This is essential to the development of our country. Excluding this generation from democratic institutions would be a terrible mistake. Since the 1980s, we have seen that there has been a steady decline in young people's voter turnout. In 2008, only 58% of the population Canadian went to polling stations. This trend is even more dramatic among young people. In 2011, only 38% of them turned out to vote. That's 18 to 24-year-olds. This is concerning, and this trend could increase over time. If young people do not vote now, and if they do not vote in their first elections in which they're eligible, they're less likely to vote later. In other words, the initial voter turnout will lead to a decline in later voter turnout. It's essential that all players do everything possible to change the situation. We are concerned that changes to the Elections Act, particularly Section 18, if Bill C-23 is adopted, would not improve the situation. Quite on the contrary. There are 4 factors that influence young voter turnout. The first is considering voting as a duty. The second is the understanding of the electoral process. Third, understanding political issues, including the way the state operates and the role of political parties. And then there's also the question of interest and motivation. These 4 factors need to be considered. We could consider voting as a duty, but if we're not interested in the issues of the election campaign, or if the person doesn't consider how the state works, then they may not vote. Obviously, it's not the responsibility of it is the responsibility of the CEO to consider these factors. He should at least be able to promote the idea that voting is a duty, as is currently the case. He should be able to do this in addition to provide information about where and when to vote. We do not think that Section 18 should be changed. It is essential to preserve voter education. Elections Canada conducted a study in 2011 to understand why young people do or do not participate in elections. They determined that factors 1, 3, and 4 mentioned before were just as important as factor number 2, in other words, where and when to vote. According to our experience in the last few weeks, we've seen that the lack of understanding of the way the state works and poor understanding of political parties and the impact of the vote were really the key factors. These young people said they felt uncomfortable because they didn't understand these issues. And they didn't understand everything about the political party they would be voting for. We need to do more than simply provide factual information. For example, there are tools available that allow people to compare the different political platforms and to help them understand how important it is to have their voices heard. It's obvious that we need to ensure that young people know where, when, and how to vote, but they also need to be able to answer questions like, why are they voting? It is possible to promote this information in a nonpartisan way. We did that over the last 4 weeks. A young person will not turn out to vote if he doesn't know who to vote for or who he wants to vote for. The CEO provides factual information about the vote, and we do not want to prevent him from working on the more important barrier to voting, in other words, the motivational aspect. It's clear. Elections Canada conducted a study that showed that student mock votes had a positive impact on voter turnout. It's important to communicate about political parties and the fact that voting can be a civic duty. It really encourages these 4 factors that impact voter turnout. According to the CEO of Quebec Elections, 40% of young people who saw advertising campaigns were encouraged to go out and vote. We think that the CEO should be able to provide quality information about voting information. And we should encourage young people to see voting as a duty. We should help them understand our political system and increase their interest in politics. It is important to come back to the real meaning of Section 18. And the CEO needs to have the power to provide informational campaigns, not only about where and when to vote, but also about the reasons for voting. We hope that it will be possible for all parties to agree to amend this bill and to help encourage young people to come out and vote rather than doing the contrary. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Cormier.
Cormier, Executive Director at Apathy is Boring. L'Apathy C'est Plate est un organisme caritatif non partisan.
Apathy is Boring is a charitable, non-partisan organization which, since 2004, has informed Canadians about democracy. In keeping with our strict nonpartisanship policy, we do not advocate on matters of public policy, and this includes not taking a public stance for or against the Fair Elections Act. Our goal here is to provide an accurate, impartial, and balanced analysis of the youth electoral context in Canada and in relation to the Fair Elections Act, with the hope that this will be a valuable addition to the current debate.
Youth do not form a voting bloc that sways as a whole one way or another, and this is in fact proven by various studies. One example of this is the Student Vote program, which has shown that high school mock election results roughly mirror actual electoral results. Also, a recent poll found that 18 to 24-year-olds support Canadian political parties in proportions that are similar to other age groups, and even the issues they prioritize are roughly the same as those of older generations, including people over the age of 60. Despite these similarities between generations, voter turnout in Canada is not evenly distributed amongst age groups. Youth vote at a rate significantly lower than their elders, and this is happening throughout the Western world, not only here in Canada. L'autre problème est que la décision de voter ou de ne pas voter.
The other problem is that deciding to vote or not to vote is a habit that is formed at a young age. People who do not vote in the first 2 elections for which they're eligible tend not to vote later in their life. Study after study shows that a determining factor in turnout is motivation. Nonpartisan motivational campaigns have had a measurable impact on voter turnout, and the statement that I presented to you has the proof of that.
An important role to play in motivating citizens to vote. That being said, nonpartisan actors are also key because they do not have a stake in the outcome of any given election. While political parties may choose to speak to their base and undecided voters, both of whom are current voters, nonpartisan actors play a fundamental role by encouraging non-voters to become voters, thereby continually renewing the pool of electors and the health of our democracy. If Elections Canada is no longer empowered to invest in and conduct outreach campaigns that promote voting, who then will actively reach out to non-voting citizens and youth who are deciding for the first time whether or not to vote? Will Elections Canada be able to continue to invest in research projects that aim to understand the trend in youth voter turnout and identify which strategies are cost-effective for turning the trend around? Another barrier to voting is that youth have high levels of mobility. They move away from home, they go off to college, and they move again to find work. and the unemployment rate in Canada for youth is very bad. As a result, these young adults are less often correctly inscribed on the electoral list. To make voting easier for youth, Apathy is Boring recommended in a report commissioned in 2008 that Elections Canada could capitalize on changes to ID requirements to increase accessibility to elections. VICs were deemed to be a logical choice because even before Elections Canada piloted their project with these cards, our research found that many people thought that the VIC was an acceptable form of identification because it seemed to contain all the information listed as being acceptable. Voters may have 39 alternative forms of authorized ID, but the problem is that if high mobility results in someone's address being incorrect on one of these, that usually means that it is incorrect on the remaining ones as well. In such circumstances, common to young Canadians, vouching and VICs can indeed facilitate access to voting. If tighter ID requirements are implemented, it will be indeed crucial to ask the question, what means will be put in place to counter the potentially challenging impacts of tighter voter identification on young eligible voters who are not correctly on the voting list? In attempting to safeguard democracy from administrative risks, how can we also ensure that we do not expose our democracy to another important risk, the immediate and continued decline of youth voter turnout and the impact this might have on long-term voting habits? Une démocratie peut être bien administrée.
A democracy may be well administered and free from irregularities, but what value will that democracy have if this regularity comes at the expense of citizens who are not encouraged to participate in the democratic process? Our team at Apathy is Boring hopes that youth's electoral engagement will be a key part of the debate over C23. We will continue our charitable, nonpartisan work to carry out our mission of educating young Canadians about democracy. In order to do so, we need the support of our partners, the government, political parties, electoral agencies, community groups, donors, and, of course, young volunteers. Thank you.
Mr. Cormier, we'll go to a 7-minute round of questions, and we'll try and keep it tight so we can do the committee business at the end. Please, I think I have Mr. Reid, you're first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. I'm going to start my questions with Dr. Cormier. Forgive me for saying this, Dr. Cormier, but you look very young to be a doctor, so...
It's been 2 weeks. Thank you. Well done. Good.
Are you used to people calling you that?
No, this is the first. I'm enjoying it.
Well, it happened on television, sir.
Oh, there.
You got a clip of this.
Well, there you
Go
are.
ahead, Mr. Reid.
So what I wanted to address is, actually got a whole bunch of things I want to address. You've done a very interesting presentation. But the first thing is just a problem that was identified by the Chief Electoral Officer or by Elections Canada in the 2011 post-election National Youth Survey report. And they went through and tried to determine reasons why young people hadn't voted. And when they're dealing with the side of it that is not attitudinal, but rather with actual impediments to voting, they do cite difficulty in providing identification or proof of address, but they also cite not receiving a voter card. And the obvious point that I think is easy to understand is those people who are least likely to have a long-term residence that has been established and the records collected and so on are also those who are least likely to get the voter card. When they broke down the youth into subgroups looking at underprivileged youth, they found that for ethnocultural youth, the top reason for not voting was not receiving a voter information card. For unemployed youth not in school, the top reason not receiving a voter card. And for youth with disabilities, the same thing. So it suggests that the voter information card is just unlikely to be a solution to the expansion that he proposes, the CEO proposes to the voter information card is not likely to actually resolve the problem. I think some other mechanism has to be found. Anyway, I just offered that as an editorial to you, but I really wanted to ask you about this card that you handed out. This is really good. I've been following, like everybody was, the Quebec election. I had not seen this until today, but I did see, in fact, I took a photograph of it, an ad put by the Quebec Chief Electoral Officer on the side of a bus, and it says, "Notre vote, c'est un pouvoir," and there's a big X, and it says, "Je vote." And I have to say that I don't find that to be...
Our vote is a power.
On the other hand, I look at what you've got here, and I gather this is done with this CEO's cooperation. It's a joint effort?
Yeah.
And what I notice on here is you've got this chart on the back. Your instructions say if I use the QR code, I can get all the answers using the interactive online version. I took out my camera and did exactly that. I then tried finding out the part about find your polling station, and you click on the pink bits on the interactive site, and I was brought to something where I can fill in my postal code and get a polling station. I can't determine what accuracy this has, but I'm really impressed, and I wonder if you could tell us more about this effort, which, as far as I know, has not been replicated at the federal level and perhaps should be.
Yes, I mean, this card, we talk about accessibility and we talk about motivation. Well, this card tries to do both. On one side, we're giving arguments as to why people should vote and why their vote matters. And on the other side, we're obviously trying to create all the mechanisms that are needed for someone who's never voted before to know how to vote. And I think the interactive part of it is probably the nicest part of it. It just allows you to click your way through a fairly complicated ordeal. In terms of your question with regard to VICs, our analysis with regard to the entire question, in fact, is just we need to put as many different tools as possible on the table so that if one of those tools works, great. If that one doesn't work, there's another one and another one and another one. So my goal eventually is to get this out, obviously, for the federal elections 2015. We're going to go big. And we've shown that it's actually worked really well. What's interesting with this particular version is that it was done in cooperation with the National Association of Friendship Centres, and it was targeted to Aboriginal youth in Quebec who are known to have a very low voter turnout. And my partner Naka is here from the NAFC. And thanks to Twitter and Facebook, we're able to target in ways that we could never do so in the past, so that we know now, and we can track it, that people in Natashquan, Sept-Îles, Val-d'Or, Chibougamau were reading this information and getting all they needed to vote.
Would you be able to provide, if the information has been collated, the committee with the results of that, showing what kind of results you got from it, and any thoughts you have as to A, how well it worked, and B, how it could be improved in the future? Obviously, the reason I'm asking these things is if one were to look at this and try doing something like this at the federal level, we would want to learn from examples. And I mean, among the issues that occur to me would be issues like, are you finding that it's getting used more by people who are in rural, urban areas, which kind of demographic, how far in advance one has to start preparing something like this, and so on?
Let's see. Now, the most important part about when it comes to figuring out if something worked or not, the cost effectiveness, is the partnerships with the electoral agencies. And I'll give you an example. Recently, in 2013, we partnered with Elections Canada and Elections BC to do a registration drive in British Columbia, in which we sent street teams to bars, campuses, everywhere where there happened to be youth. We were there registering people to vote. And the outcome of that, we're going to be publishing soon, but we don't have the results yet, but are very promising. And what allowed us to measure it was that Elections BC was tracking every single person that we registered to vote was being tracked. And then when they went to vote afterwards, we could identify what the percentage of voter turnout was for the treatment group, the group that we had registered. So those are going to be published in the next month. And with regard to this particular project, we're handing in a report to the DGAQ within the next month as well, so we can probably table it here if you'd like a copy of it. Absolutely.
We would love that. Thank you very much. It was very helpful.
You have about 25 seconds left. We could just chat, or I could go to
That's okay.
Madam
Why don't you
Latson.
go to the NDP? Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Madam Latson, 7 minutes for you, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Maybe a 5-second for Mr. Reid.
C'est très gentil, Monsieur Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Reid, and thank you, Mr. Chair. To be perfectly honest and to explain my background, I would tell Madame Laberge that I was at the Rimouski Cégep, and so I participated in some of your events in the early 2000s, so I'm quite familiar with your work to help increase youth voter turnout in Quebec. And I think it's very important work. And for me, that was my first experience with politics through student politics. So I think that's something that's really interesting and that's working well. I really liked your presentation and the 4 factors that you mentioned. And it's important to specify that the main reason young people don't go out to vote is because they don't go out to vote. Well, that's not necessarily the reality, as you said. That's just an excuse that's given, and you explained that very well. A lot of people just use that as an excuse because they're ashamed that they don't know the system. They're not really sure if it's worth going out to vote. So there's a real disengagement among young people. And it's true that often they will just say, oh, well, you know, I didn't know where to vote, when in fact they could have found that information. So it's an excuse that young people often give. Personally, listening to the government's argument for why they're changing Section 18, I can't understand why they think that these 2 things are mutually exclusive. There's no reason not to say to Elections Canada, please focus on this, you know, emphasize the fact that young people need to be informed of where and when to vote, but, you know, still continue these democratic motivation programs. Would you like to add anything about that? Yes, and I'll just go back to something that I said in my presentation. What you need to understand is that answering the questions of when and where to vote is not enough. The logical extension of those questions is why and for whom are you voting? During the election campaign in Quebec, when I met with students, I would ask 4 questions. The first is, do you know if you are on the voters list? The second was, do you know if you will be able to vote on your campus? Because the Quebec Elections Act was changed so that students could vote outside of their ridings in the place where they're studying. The next question is, do you know who you will vote for? And often at that point, people would say, well, they weren't exactly panicky, but they would say, no, I don't really know. And that was where you sense this disengagement. So I would say, you know, you have to choose before Election Day, because if you don't choose, then you may not go out to vote on the morning of Election Day. And finally, I would say, can you give me one reason that for which you want to vote?
I know that the argument is that political parties will take care of that, but, you know, I've experienced election campaigns, and the political parties don't look after that aspect because they have a whole host of things, a whole host of different segments of the population that they're trying to target. And, you know, the fact is that young people tend to vote for one party rather than another. So, you know, there's no attempt to simplify election issues for young people during an election campaign. So we need other tools to help. Also, for young people, it's their first election. Political parties, they're not familiar with political parties and the issues during an election campaign. So sometimes, you know, they focus on particular attacks by one party against another, and it's at those particular times that young people are lost in the process. You know, we need to convince people that voting is a duty, to help them understand the electoral process, get them engaged in the whole idea of elections. There's work to be done both during a campaign and after and outside campaign times. And I think the CEO has a role to play in this awareness building. It's the only way to increase initial voter turnout. Currently, it's at 58%. I think it's urgent that we act. You know, not increasing voter turnout for the next 10 years would be a big problem, and I think we need to attack the problem. I have a very specific question for Mr. Shedletsky on a number of the specific provisions of the bill. There are some powers that would be taken away from Elections Canada under Bill C-23. For example, the commissioners or Elections Canada's ability to compel political parties to provide information, for example. Could I have your opinion on that?
We think that the Chief Electoral Officer and the Commissioner of Canada and all of the independent experts who have studied this know a lot better and are the experts on this that we should be listening to, rather than a party who has an implicit, or at least the perception, of bias. And when you look at the chief electoral officer requesting certain things, there's very little rationale other than that they want to improve the functioning of our democracy. So in the absence of evidence to the contrary, it would be our perspective that you'd want to give the chief electoral officer and our elections watchdogs the powers they requested, whether that's to compel parties to provide documentary evidence of receipts of money that they spend, or more importantly, in our opinion, the power to compel testimony. I mean, you look at the rest of Canada, I believe 7 provinces have the power to compel testimony. Australia has the power to compel testimony. The United States has the power to compel testimony. You know, just saying that because the police don't have it, Elections Canada shouldn't have it is not a rationale. The Competitions Bureau has it. They used it 26 times last year, and very effective. The Auditor General has it. So in our opinion, we generally trust the recommendations of independent and nonpartisan experts.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Lamoureux. 7 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I, too, was, like Mr. Reid, was looking at the card, and it's a very impressive card, I must say. And that's one of the things that I truly believe, that if you want to get more young people to vote, then get young people engaged in encouraging young people to get out and vote. And one of the thoughts that came across my mind was the ICR on the back. The ICRs, they're called. You know, how something of that nature would go on a voter card, or how our voter cards themselves could actually change, maybe modernize a little bit type of thing. The question that a couple of questions, and I wouldn't mind to get a quick comment from the 3 of you on this, is the current voter information card. Do you believe that it is important that we keep that in principle, maybe change or look for ways of modifying it, improving it? Do you think it would be a mistake for us to get rid of the that particular card, or devalue the card in any way?
That's unfortunately something I can't really comment on because of the nature of my organization.
Pour les cartons de vote, c'est...
Are you talking about the voter cards? Is that what you mean? Well, yes, I do think it's important to keep them. We stress the fact that there are obstacles to access to voting for young people because they're travelling, for example, or their home residence changes. So it's important to simplify the tools at their disposal to get access to voting. So I think that voter information cards are a means to achieve that. As I said, in Quebec, we got an amendment to the Election Act passed so that youth can vote on their campuses regardless of where their home residences are. That's another way of simplifying access to voting, especially for people who are travelling or don't have access to ID. So we need to find tools like that for the whole Canadian public, so that they have what they need to get out and vote.
Voter information card is very important and should be maintained. If you look at the evidence, between 36 and 73% of Canadians that were part of a 900,000 person pilot used this card, and there was no reported fraud whatsoever. So we need to figure out what's the balance between making it as easy as possible for people to vote and ensuring with 100% certainty the integrity of every single voter who votes in Canada. There's a balance. Every single piece of ID has problems. My understanding is that the voter information card is the most accurate form of government ID. I believe that's correct. So if that's the case, then why should we be not permitting that use of ID and permitting other uses of ID? It doesn't make any sense to us.
Yeah, it's not a perfect data bank, but there is no such thing as a perfect data bank. I made comment in terms of if you want to get good ideas in terms of how youth should get more engaged. You often go to youth. I recall the benefits of these youth parliaments. You know, I've been a parliamentarian for over 20 years now, And I find that the number of youth parliaments seems to be decreasing. I don't know if you have any sense of that, but it seems to go more than just about, when do I vote and how do I vote. It gets them engaged in a very real and intangible way. I often thought, if Elections Canada did a study on that, maybe Elections Canada should be doing promotions of youth parliament in order to get young people thinking about politics. They're definitely opinionated if you ask them questions. If you were posed, and I'll pose the question to you, how do you believe, what would be an initiative that you think Elections Canada could do if it in fact had the authority, because the authority is being taken away under Section 18, of course? Are there ideas, or if you want to comment on the Youth Parliament, you can do that you think would be important, that would help encourage youth to be engaged in politics?
I'll start by going back to the previous question and then answer this one as well. There's something that I can mention with regard to the voter information cards. We found that there's a survey by ECOS that suggested that 72% of the people who were allowed to use the VIC as a proof of identification thought that it had made voting easier or much easier, and that's something to keep in mind when we know that youth are finding it hard to vote. With regard to your current question, I think that the most important thing for us with regard to our partnership with Elections Canada is their expertise in research and their ability to help us measure our success and measure our impact. And when I go back to what I was mentioning a while ago with our Elections BC and Elections Canada partnership, we were able to measure how far we can get in terms of raising the voter turnout just by interacting with youth and tracking that interaction. It's worth noting that peer-to-peer, in-person campaigns have been shown in American research projects to raise voter participation by up to 8 or 10%. So it's a huge impact. And again, we also know that when youth speak to youth, they get a lot more done in terms of getting the vote out. So that's something to keep in mind. And if there's any way that Elections Canada can help make those interactions happen, then obviously it's going to have an impact.
En notre sens, Élections Canada.
Well, Elections Canada, just like Elections Quebec, could do more when it comes to education and awareness building, because that's a key element in youth voter turnout. I think most of the work to get voter turnout is done prior to the election taking place. So Elections Canada needs to, of course, focus on how important it is to vote during the election process, but they also need to do so beforehand. And I think that model parliaments are crucial. They engage our youth. They get them interested in politics. The programs like Vote Étudiant and its partner program in Quebec, they're also crucial because it helps young people many years before they actually participate in their first election what it means to vote. Getting interested in politics is important when it comes to voting, and the first step when you're young is to see what's going around at a local level, and that's how we'll help young people to understand national politics better.
If we stay good, we'll be able to finish our day with everything intact. Mr. Richards, 4 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think I'll direct my questions mainly at you, Ms. LaBerge, just because what I wanted to discuss is essentially relates to students who are away from the home they grew up in to attend post-secondary school. So I think you'd probably be best placed to respond. My understanding in some of the past witnesses we've had in the committee that for those students in particular, it's been pointed out that they feel that people are feeling that there may be concerns for them to be able to meet the ID requirements. And my understanding is there doesn't seem to be any issue with improving who they are. All students have a student card or whatever. So there's no issue to prove who they are. It's proving their address of residence that I'm led to believe is the problem. And I'm just wondering, like, for example, one of the pieces is correspondence from a school or educational institution. Things like a bank statement or bank records, tax assessments, because most students do, of course, work during the summer, so there would be a tax assessment. These kinds of things are all items that can be used to prove residence. So can you tell me a little bit what the issue is there in terms of why those aren't sufficient for students to be able to prove their residence? Of course, there's also the attestation from a student residence as well, if they do live in residence. Can you just tell me a little bit about why that? And if you can try to keep it brief, because I have a few other questions as well.
Rapidement,
Very quickly, I didn't point this out earlier, but we're not experts when it comes to ID. The crux of our presentation didn't focus on that, but the answer I gave earlier was more that we need to ensure that if we do make an amendment or make changes as important as these that are proposed with regards to identifying oneself, we need to properly explain the reasons for making those changes. And, perhaps having polling booths in schools is something that could be done at a Canada-wide level, which is currently done in Quebec.
I asked the question is I'm struggling to see where there would be an issue for a student to be able to prove their residence, and here's how I come to that. Because when you're a student and you're attending a post-secondary institution away from home, you have a choice. You and where you're voting, and it's determined by where you consider your residence to be, where your permanent home is, and that home is either going to be the home that you grew up in with your parents, where you're going to return in the summer, like in most cases, or it's going to be where you consider now home at the place where you're attending the institution, this academic institution, if that's what you consider to be your permanent residence. And so, obviously, what we've heard from many people is that in the case where they are attending the school away, but their parents' home is where they are receiving all their correspondence, to me that would sort of indicate that is in fact their home. And I think one of the problems is that Elections Canada is doing a very poor job right now of letting people in those kinds of situations know what all the options are to them, because there are a number of options. There is, of course, a special ballot that someone can have through the mail. I also believe that that they can appear in a returning office anywhere in the country, so at the place they're in school, prior to advanced polling day, and cast a ballot for their home riding. So there's plenty of opportunity to, if your residence is there, you're able to prove it, you can cast one there. At school, of course, you would have a residence there, say the residence, or you'd move your mailing, obviously, to your permanent residence.
I'm rather liking my invisibility. Thank you, Mr. Richards. Yeah. We'll move on to Mr. Scott for 4 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, and thank you all three for such powerful and articulate presentations. I particularly want to recognize Lee Now with respect to this particular bill. Right from the beginning, you helped raise the alarm with Canadians, and also you said something very important, Mr. Shiletsky, at near the beginning of your presentation. You said something. There are many problems in C-23, and a focus on voter ID risks diverting our attention from those other elements. And I'll come back to that, because I'd like you to, after I've made a couple of other comments, just to summarize what you think really needs attention beyond the voter ID stuff. On the encouragement of voting, it's also worth noting that this bill makes it much harder to do experiments with online voting. It's singled out for not just House of Commons, full House of Commons approval and thus blocking, but Senate blocking of any such pilot projects, which I would have thought from the student perspective is not something all that welcome, because I'm sure I hope students would want us to be ready when the technology and public confidence level is there. for online voting to be used, at least in a sort of a supplementary way. And the last thing is I very much hope that at some point we will have a fair elections bill that's about fair voting, that's about making every vote count, and that would include proportional representation within our electoral system, which we know from more or less we can increase the vote by 2 to 5% as well. So that said, apathy is boring. This is an amazing document, this card. But the irony is that if we were to look at this in terms of post-C23, it's not even clear Elections Canada would be able to partner with this at all, because the new language of Section 18 talks about an exclusive list of things that Elections Canada can do, and the Chief Electoral Officer may provide the public with information on the following topics only. Now, those topics include this side, okay, but they would never include this side. The future is ours. 50% of the Aboriginal population is under 27. It's up to us to own it. Elections Canada would be banned from helping with this side. They might even be banned from helping with this side because the language in the existing Act for the Chief Electoral Officer may implement public education information programs is removed, and the provision that says the Chief Electoral Officer may use any media or other means is removed. So it's not at all clear that the current provision will even allow partnerships with bodies such as yourself. So I think that should be a real concern, given how you are advancing the ball down the field with this kind of stuff. So back to Mr. Shiletsky. I'm wondering if you could just tell us what you think we should be paying attention to. You have about a minute.
Well, in our opinion, this bill is a battle between talking points and reason. On one hand, you have the government saying it is fair and reasonable that Canadians should have to show ID to vote. And that's a good talking point. That's what they want to make this bill about. That's what they want to make this bill about. They don't want to make it about not giving the power to compel testimony, but accepting fundraising costs, about muzzling Elections Canada, about not permitting voter engagement campaigns, about appointing central polling officers in a partisan manner rather than neutral and unbiased way. They want to focus it on their talking point. And I think it's important, and our community thinks it's important, that we focus on the broader bill, the challenges that we face in terms of not having an all-party process, of having the perception of bias in addition to actual bias in this bill that's going to stack the deck in the favor of the Conservative Party for 2015. So that's why we need to focus on the entirety of this bill and work as hard as we can to stop it.
Thank you very much. I have one more speaking spot for the government side. Mr. Lukiski, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. Just a question. I honestly don't know the answer to this, and that's why I'm going to ask the question. You've all talked about, in part during your presentations, about the need to try and increase voter participation from young people. Elections Canada over the past number of years has had initiatives to try and increase voter participation, yet the statistics show that the participation of the younger demographic, and I think from 18 to 25, has actually gone down significantly. So I'm not saying that their advertising is pushing people away, but I'd like to get your views on why you think that young people now, after an extensive advertising campaign and voter information campaign from Elections Canada, is actually proving to be non-effective.
Maybe I can start with that one. The question is extremely wide. Obviously, we're seeing something that's international, not just here in Canada. And there's a lot of factors at play, including, for example, youth poverty and youth unemployment and youth education level. So more people are going to school. That has an impact of making people move a lot. And one generation ago, our parents were a lot richer than current youth are. There's been a 12% decrease in the accumulated wealth of people under the age of 30 in the past 30 years, despite the fact that the economy has grown considerably since then. This is in real numbers, in real dollars, constant dollars. The impact is that youth don't own homes at the same rate that their parents would have owned homes back in the 70s or 60s. And that's one of the factors that increases voter participation and civic engagement. There's research that shows that if you're a homeowner, you're more engaged in your community. And again, you're much more likely to be on the registration list because you're stable in your living place. Now, to give you an example of what this means in BC, I don't have the numbers for the federal government, but I encourage you to search them out. People over the age of 60 in BC are 91% likely to be correctly on the registration list, whereas that drops to 72% for people who are under the age of 30. But if you add to that people who aren't even on the list, so this is the accuracy of the list itself is much lower for younger people. But then you have to add to that the fact that a lot of young people are simply not on the list at all. So in BC, there's 55% of youth who are either not on the electoral list or incorrectly on the electoral list. So what we need to do, if we're going to talk about getting people out to vote in a year from now for the federal elections, we already have to start figuring out how we're going to get people to be correctly on the list, and that means a huge brainstorm nationally to fix that problem.
Well, one of the provisions in Bill C-23 is the requirement for Elections Canada to communicate with Canadians as to the methods and how to vote. Which would address some of the concerns, as you're saying, that a lot of younger people particularly aren't aware of not so much whether they should be voting and what their constitutional rights are and the benefits of participating in the voting process, but the nuts and bolts of how to, which in itself would be a promotional campaign, just because anytime you're talking about voting in an election in general, you're promoting the fact that an election is imminent. So would a concentrated campaign directed, perhaps targeted, towards younger voters on the how-tos, the nuts and bolts about what do you need to do to be able to vote, when the election would be held, where the voting would be held, how and what kinds of ID you would need to vote, would that be effective in your view?
It's only part of the answer, because a lot of
Would that portion be effective?
Would that portion be effective? Not unless there's motivation backing it so that people want to find out how to vote. If you don't make that first leap, you're not going to do the extra mile to find out.
Les milliers d'étudiants à qui on a parlé dans les...
The thousands of students with whom we've spoken to over recent weeks were clear. They said if they don't understand why they're voting, or if they don't know who they're voting, information about where and how they're going to vote is useless to them. They're not going to go looking for it. It's just as important to know why you're voting, what your options are, what the political parties have put on the table, as knowing how to vote.
I could go on longer on this, but we're going to have a bit of committee business, and I must leave at 1 o'clock today. I have a Skype interview with a high school class, which is I've been looking forward to. So
That'll get them up to vote.
That's it.
You're doing your part. You're doing your part.
Okay, make fun of the chair. It works. And so we will adjourn and thank our guests for. We won't adjourn. We won't do any of that. We'll suspend while our witnesses leave. Yeah, I better suspend now that I've gavelled. So suspend just for a minute while our witnesses leave. We'll come back for committee business very quickly, folks. Thanks. We've got exactly 3 minutes till the chair must leave. So, Madame La Tendresse, I believe it's your motion.
Yes, it is.
All right. So, would you like to speak to it,
Absolument.
or are we just going to vote on it?
En fait, je pense que ça serait important.
Absolutely. I think it's important to explain why we wanted to move this motion. The Minister on several occasions said that he was waiting for the committee's proposed amendments and to see what would happen. But I think it's important that we inform all members of the progress that has been made in committee. We have made some headway, and to be able to make a summary of what we've heard thus far in committee and all the witnesses and experts that have come to have a good snapshot of everything that they've said so that we can improve the bill as much as possible.
Sure, well, go for it.
Well,
Mr. Christopherson?
I have to say, I'm getting some indication from the government members that they're not going to support this. Now, for all the blocks and challenges and everything else that this government has done in terms of thwarting the work of this committee, real work, to vote against a summary of the testimony, they have got to be kidding, Chair. They have got to be kidding. I would like to hear one of the government members take the floor and defend publicly why we're not going to ask our analysts to give us a summary of the testimony. Is the government prepared to, are they going to speak?
Certainly. Well, I have Mr. Lamoureux and then I have Mr. Lukiski.
Good. Then I'd like to speak
at
after
1
Mr.
o'clock,
Lukiski.
I'm going.
Well, that may be, Chair, but I can't believe that this isn't a motherhood motion and it's just flying through, and of course we're going to do it.
Mr. Chair, I do have one question. In it, you're saying that this summary, the mover is saying that in this summary, not include any recommendations to the committee on how to proceed with the legislation. Why would you want to exclude that? Just the rationale behind it.
And direct the committee on how to vote.
I'll go to the mover and get her explanation, if you'd like, Madame Latanzas.
Je pense que c'est clair que ce qu'on voulait, c'est...
Well, I think it's clear that what we wanted from the Library of Parliament was an impartial summary of what we've seen to date in terms of testimony. We're not wanting to give anybody any instructions. We just want a fulsome summary of what's been said to date in committee.
Recommendations that would be provided by our analysts, would they not be apolitical in their nature, or do they get the recommendations from government?
We're walking new ground here, Mr. Lamoureux. A summary of evidence on a piece of legislation. Normally, the witnesses give us their input, and then the committee members who are here taking that evidence go into clause by clause, and that is usually the summary of what we're doing. So I'm sorry, I'm not certain I can answer your question.
Yeah, I don't have a problem in terms of supporting the motion, but in addition to that, I would like to be able to receive whatever recommendations that they might have. I am approaching this with an open mind. So.
All right, well, we thank you for that, and we'll leave you on the speaking list, and we have Mr. Lukiski next when we next meet.